Imagine choosing to leave a, a warm, perfectly safe house just to go stand completely unprotected in a Category 5 hurricane.
Right, which sounds completely insane.
Totally. But according to the philosophy we're exploring today, that is the literal definition of true love.
It really is. It turns the whole concept on its head.
So welcome to today's deep dive. I'm so glad you could join us because today we have a pretty intense mission for you.
We do. We're asking you to take your modern, everyday assumptions about love, about empathy, and, well, what it means to actually care for another person, and just set them aside for a moment.
Yeah, because we usually think of love as this emotional safety net, you know? You come home after a long, hard day, and love is the thing that makes you feel safe, seen, and happy.
Exactly. We treat it as a retreat from the harshness of the world.
Right. But today we're looking at an incredibly demanding, really intense philosophical and theological framework from the unification movement. It's centered around a profound Korean concept called Shimjung,
And this framework argues that true love isn't a retreat into comfort at all. It's actually an active immersion into cosmic grief.
which is just a massive shift in perspective. To guide us through this, our stack of sources today includes some really fascinating analytical excerpts breaking down the teachings of unification movement founder Sun Myung Moon.
And crucially, we're also looking at a primary source. It's a deeply emotional 30-year culmination prayer delivered on a holy day known as the Parents' Blessing.
Yeah, and looking at these texts, I mean, it feels less like reading theology and more like reading the blueprints for a completely different kind of human emotional architecture.
That's a great way to put it. And before we can even begin to understand how this philosophy is supposed to change the world out there, we first have to understand how it redefines the human heart in here.
So let's get into that. That redefinition really starts by contrasting our typical Western concept of true love with the rigorous emotional taxonomy of Shimjung.
Right, because in the West, true love is used as this highly commercialized catch-all term.
Oh, absolutely. It means altruism, romance, giving to charity.
Or even just practicing self-care,
Yeah.
feeling cozy. It's broad, subjective, and frankly, a bit blurry.
Yeah, whereas Shimjung, on the other hand, is ruthlessly specific. Let's actually break that word down because the text gets very analytical about its anatomy.
It does. The word is composed of two parts. You have shim, which translates to heart, and jung, which translates to feeling.
Right, and the sources point out that this isn't some monolithic, flat state of affection. It encompasses this massive spectrum of intensity.
Yeah, it includes joy, it includes sorrow, and it introduces another crucial concept alongside it, which is gurium.
Agurium, which translates to a deep, visceral longing.
Right. It's not just missing someone because they're out of town for the weekend. It's an ache in the bones.
Yeah.
It's a yearning that fundamentally alters how you move through the physical world.
And here's where the text introduces a concept that just completely stopped me in my tracks. It states that Shimjung is an unresolved history of the heart.
Unresolved is the key word there.
Exactly. Because according to this framework, humanity currently exists in a period of historical disconnection from the divine.
Right. So the experience of Shimjun right now is defined by a Heavenly Father's own sorrow over that disconnection.
Which means to enter into this state isn't just deciding to be nicer to your neighbor, it's actively participating in a cosmic grief.
That's heavy.
It's incredibly heavy. I actually have to read this exact quote from the source material because it lays it out with such overwhelming weight.
Go for it.
The text says, quote, "As for sorrow, there is no sorrow greater than the sorrow coming through the Shimjung of love. As for suffering, there is no suffering greater than the suffering coming through the Shimjung of love. As for joy, there is no joy greater than the joy coming through the Shimjung of love." End quote.
I mean, wow. It elevates human emotion to a literal cosmic scale.
It really does.
You're no longer just feeling your own feelings. You are tapping into the emotional baseline of the universe itself.
Okay, but I have to push back a little on the modern appeal of this concept. Because, like we said, Western love is marketed to us as that warm blanket to retreat into. The way this text describes Shimjung, we're back to that analogy of walking out of your perfectly safe house and standing in the middle of a hurricane.
Right, the Category 5 hurricane.
Yeah. Why in the world would anyone willingly choose to enter a state defined by the greatest suffering imaginable?
Well, in this framework, avoiding the pain.
Staying inside your safe house.
Exactly,
Yeah.
staying inside with your warm blanket. Doing that means you are actively avoiding the reality of the sentient experience. You're choosing to live a numbed existence.
Oh, wow.
Because love, in the context of Shimjung, is not about optimizing your personal comfort. It's about participating fully in the reality of the universe.
Right, so if the divine is currently in a state of unresolved sorrow due to this fractured relationship with humanity.
Then to shield yourself from that sorrow is to disconnect yourself from truth. You have to be willing to experience the absolute lowest lows of existence in order to build the capacity to experience the highest highs.
So you can't selectively numb the bad without numbing the good.
Precisely. If you shrink your capacity to feel the universe's pain, you proportionally shrink your capacity to feel its joy.
You're artificially capping your own human experience.
You are.
Okay, so if we accept that true love requires standing out in that hurricane of cosmic grief, the immediate practical problem becomes, well, how do you actually function around other people who are also caught in that storm?
And this brings us to what the sources call a radical act of displacement.
Right, which might be the most disruptive lesson in the entire stack of materials today, because it's a total rejection of the egocentric model of feeling.
Yeah, think about how we usually operate. In most modern contexts, we measure love by how the other person makes us feel.
Right. Does this person make me happy? Do they fulfill my needs? Do they support my career goals?
Exactly. The center of the universe is still me. It's a very Ptolemaic view of emotion where everything orbits the self.
Right, but Shimjung demands a Copernican shift.
It demands you completely vacate that center. You have to initiate this radical displacement where you move your center of gravity completely out of your own psyche.
And relocate it into the lived reality of another person.
Yes. Moon defines the test of love not by how satisfied you feel in a relationship, but by your capacity to actually feel the other person's reality as if it were your own.
And the sources are very clear that under this framework, empathy is not passive understanding.
Oh, not at all.
It's not sitting across from a friend, nodding, and saying, oh, wow, that sounds really hard for you. That's passive observation.
Right. Shimjung defines empathy as a total resonance.
Total resonance, meaning the other person's needs, their sorrows, their fears, literally become the primary drivers of your own internal life.
Where the ultimate goal is to inhabit the perspective of the other person so deeply that you take up the burden of their situation.
And their burden literally becomes your privilege.
Which is a complete inversion of how we view emotional boundaries today.
Oh, complete.
We're constantly taught to protect our peace, curate our spaces, keep a healthy distance from other people's trauma so we don't get dragged down.
And look, if you are listening to this right now and thinking, I barely have the emotional bandwidth to deal with my own bad day, let alone my neighbor's trauma and the universe's grief.
You're entirely justified.
Yeah, I had the exact same thought. Let me throw another analogy at this.
Okay, let's hear it.
This radical displacement, this total resonance, to me, it sounds like holding your breath underwater to save a drowning person.
Right.
If you totally absorb someone else's sorrow, if you make their needs the absolute primary driver of your own internal life, aren't you just going to drown with them?
It seems like it.
Isn't this a guaranteed recipe for extreme emotional burnout? I mean, how can a human being sustain that level of porousness without collapsing?
It's a totally fair question. The fear of drowning in someone else's trauma is the logical modern concern. But the source text views the mechanics of this completely differently.
How so?
Well, it doesn't view total resonance as an exhausting drain on your battery. It actually describes it as an active, arousing force.
Wait, how does bearing a heavier burden generate energy instead of draining it?
Think about it like physical resistance training. Or even thermodynamics.
Okay.
If you lift a heavy weight, yeah, it costs you energy in the short term. But the act of bearing that resistance breaks down muscle fibers so they can rebuild stronger.
Right. Ultimately increasing your overall capacity.
Exactly. And the theology takes this a step further into the spiritual realm. The premise is that the world is broken specifically because everyone is operating from a disconnected place of self-satisfaction.
So it's impossible to heal those original fractures without a radical shift toward bearing the weight of the other.
Right. And when you take on that burden, you aren't just relying on your own isolated emotional battery.
Yeah.
You are plugging yourself into the underlying current of the universe.
Oh, wow.
The act of selfless resonance aligns you with the divine heart, and that alignment generates the spiritual and emotional energy required to keep going.
So it isn't draining your battery, it's plugging you into a cosmic power grid.
Precisely.
Which means if you isolate yourself to protect your energy, you actually cut yourself off from the source of that energy. That shifts the whole paradigm.
It really does.
So we've looked at how this radical empathy works on an individual interpersonal level. But how does an internal emotional state shift global systems.
Right, the macro level.
Because the source texts make a massive sweeping leap here. They scale the concept of Shimjung up from how you treat your neighbor all the way to global geopolitics.
They do. The text examines the historical scope of Moon's prayers, noting that they spanned 30 years.
30 years.
Yeah, they started from very humble, obscure beginnings in Seoul and eventually reached the global stage.
And the forces highlight that throughout all those decades, through shifting political landscapes, wars, the rise and fall of various global ideologies, there was a persistent core frequency to these prayers.
And that frequency was Gurium.
That persistent, bone-deep longing for the restoration of the bond between humanity and the divine.
Right. And the text uses a fascinating phrase to describe this. It calls it the intellectual heat of this consistency.
Intellectual heat.
Yeah. It points out that early followers were often incredulous because Moon, while operating from a position of relative obscurity, was predicting monumental global shifts, like the eventual fall of global communism.
Which, from a purely geopolitical lens, looking at the data, the military power, the nuclear arsenals, the economic structures of the time, such claims seemed absolutely impossible.
Totally impossible.
That is a massive intellectual leap. Honestly, looking at this objectively, it almost feels reckless.
Right, to ignore all the tangible data.
Yeah, relying purely on an emotional frequency. It's like, imagine a musician walking up to a massive steel suspension bridge
Okay, I like this.
and ignoring the architects, ignoring the structural engineers, the stress test, everything. The musician just puts their ear to the metal, listens to the emotional hum of the bridge, and predicts that it's going to collapse.
That's a great analogy.
I mean, how can a purely emotional state predict complex geopolitical outcomes that rational, data-driven political science completely misses?
It sounds absurd to a purely rational mind, right?
Yeah.
One that relies solely on empirical data.
Absolutely.
But the text unpacks the underlying logic very clearly. The conviction was not rooted in political data. It wasn't analyzing troop movements or economic indicators.
Right.
The conviction was rooted in the unshakable belief that the unresolved Shimjung of the relationship between God and humanity must eventually find its resolution in history.
Because the emotional pressure of that unresolved history is just too great for any man-made structure to contain indefinitely.
Exactly. A heart anchored in a singular, selfless longing perceives the trajectory of history fundamentally differently than a rational mind does.
Right, because the rational mind looks at the current physical structures
The walls, the armies, the totalitarian governments.
and assumes they're permanent because they hold a monopoly on physical force.
Right. But a heart operating in total resonance with this cosmic grief senses the underlying invisible fractures.
Oh, wow.
It operates on the premise that the baseline of the universe is a push toward restoration. Therefore, any system built on ego, division, and the suppression of the human spirit is structurally unsound.
It's fundamentally incompatible with the ultimate direction of the universe.
Yes. Because of those invisible fractures, those systems must inevitably collapse, regardless of how strong they look on paper.
So the intellectual heat comes from trusting the physics of the heart over the physics of the state.
Beautifully said.
Now, to really see this theory applied in real time, to hear what it sounds like when someone speaks from the center of that hurricane, we have to look directly at the primary source provided in our stack.
Yes, the 30-year culmination prayer.
Right, which puts the entire theory of Shimjung into practice. Let's set the scene a bit.
So this prayer was delivered on a holy day known as the Parents' Blessing. And from the very opening lines, it lays out a highly specific, tragic theology.
It does. It addresses God the Father and immediately contrasts what was supposed to be with what actually is.
Right.
The prayer states that God's providence was intended to be glorious. The vision was a garden where God could look with jubilation upon rejoicing sons and daughters.
But due to what the text calls an unthinkable fall, that entire trajectory was shattered.
Right. The providence could no longer be one of happiness. Instead, it became a deplorable providence of sadness and suffering.
And the imagery used here is stark. It describes a broken, eternal bond. Because of this break, the text says that heaven, mankind, and all of creation have lost their object.
Okay, let's pause and translate that because losing an object sounds a bit abstract.
It does, yeah.
What does that actually mean in the physics of this theology?
Think of it like a solar system.
Okay.
The sun is the object that the planets orbit. Its gravitational pull is what keeps everything in order in the light and sustaining life. If a planet suddenly loses its object, if that gravitational tether is snapped, It doesn't just stop moving. It wanders off into the freezing, chaotic dark.
Wow. So in this framework, humanity and creation basically unplugged from their divine source.
Exactly. Without that point of connection, the system fails.
That makes perfect sense. And wandering in the freezing dark is exactly what the text describes next. Because the connection is severed, everything has resided up until now in a realm of lamentation.
And the prayer doesn't stay in the abstract theological clouds either.
No, it brings this cosmic grief right down to the immediate human level.
There is an agonizing plea for the 3 billion pitiful people living on the earth at the time the prayer was given.
The speaker notes that among those 3 billion, many are raising unknown altars, crying out, beating the ground.
You can practically feel the gurium, that visceral longing, vibrating through those words.
Yeah, it's a recognition of global, agonizing searching, which leads to the core motive of the prayer, the reason for the gathering.
Right. The plea is to become sons and daughters who do not know how to yield or be defeated.
They aren't asking for personal glory or an easy life.
No, they're asking to recreate that lost ideal of creation. They're volunteering to be the ones to tie back together all those severed Shimjung bonds.
And this is where the language of the prayer gets incredibly intense. The speaker says, we must now repent for our historic guilt and the guilt of the era.
Historic guilt.
Right. I mean, it feels like inheriting a colossal, multi-generational family debt.
Yeah.
But instead of inheriting millions of dollars of financial debt from your great-grandparents, you're inheriting an ocean of cosmic emotional grief.
Right. You are being asked to pay off the sorrow of the entire human timeline.
How does someone even begin to take responsibility for the heart of God? It seems like an impossibly crushing weight for any mortal to volunteer for.
It's a staggering concept, for sure, but if you look closely at the conclusion of the source text, it provides the key to understanding how they view this monumental responsibility.
Okay, what's the key?
The history described in this framework isn't a story of God getting angry, discarding a sinful, broken mankind, and starting over from scratch somewhere else.
Right.
The text explicitly says God has been holding on to this dead world in order to recreate the lost ideal.
Holding on to a dead world, meaning the divine has been bearing the weight of this severed connection the entire time.
Exactly. Taking responsibility doesn't mean you alone have to fix the universe or single-handedly pay off the historical debt.
Okay.
It means becoming what the text calls custodians of a divine emotional reality.
Custodians.
Yes. It means stepping into the role of tying together the severed bonds, first within yourself, then your family, your tribe, your nation, and eventually the cosmos.
And you do this through absolute tearful dedication.
Right. You aren't paying off the debt alone. You are finally aligning your own heart with a divine heart that has been holding on to this wandering, freezing world all along.
You take responsibility by refusing to look away from the pain anymore.
Precisely.
Let's take a step back and look at the journey we've just been on.
It's been a big one.
It really has. We started by unpacking a highly complex emotional taxonomy. We learned about gurium, this deep, bone-aching longing that refuses to settle for a numbed existence.
Right.
We explored the radical, almost terrifying concept of ego death, vacating your own needs and relocating your center of gravity to achieve total resonance with the suffering of others.
Which is huge.
And we learned how bearing that burden doesn't drain you, but plugs you into a cosmic power source.
Right.
And then we followed that thread all the way up to a 30-year global geopolitical prayer aimed at comforting a grieving divine heart, trusting the physics of love to outlast empires.
It is a remarkable progression. It maps a path from the deepest, most hidden interior of the human heart all the way to the grandest scales of human history.
Yeah. So I want to leave you, our listener, with a direct challenge drawn straight from the source material we've been analyzing today.
Yep.
I want you to genuinely consider this question. If we measured our success not by the height of our own happiness, but by the depth of our resonance with the feelings of others,
Yeah.
how would our world change tomorrow?
And to build on that, here's a final lingering thought for you to explore on your own.
I love these.
The source text mentions that the ultimate goal is to build the completion of restoration upon the foundation of Shimjung, literally undoing the grief of history.
Right.
So imagine if, starting tomorrow morning, every world leader, every global institution, and every single individual on Earth suddenly adopted this philosophy.
Wow. Okay.
Imagine if everyone simultaneously shifted their primary metric of success away from profit, away from power, away from personal comfort, and entirely toward total resonance with the burden of others.
That's a wild thought experiment.
Right. Would our current global systems be healed by that sudden influx of radical empathy? Or because they are built so fundamentally on ego and division, would those systems instantly collapse under the sheer unmanageable weight of everyone feeling everyone else's reality all at once?
Man, would we finally heal, or would the structures of our modern world just drown in the storm? It's quite the question. It is an incredible thought experiment. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of the heart. We encourage you to keep questioning, keep exploring, and maybe the next time you feel the urge to retreat into the warm blanket of comfort, take a moment to look out the window at the storm. We'll catch you next time.